Welcome to the Concepts from the Global South podcast. Here we explore the connections between the past and present of non-European societies with the help of antique, classical, modern, emic, and etic concepts. My name is Alisa Shablovskaia, and I'm postdoctoral fellow in Iranian studies at the University of Oslo. Today in our studio we have Mustafa Akay, who is a teaching fellow at the University of Oslo and who defended his dissertation in January 2025. Mustafa's research deals with the concept of TARIH-I UMUMI, which I can translate as universal history. And Mustafa is interested in the practices, styles, and dynamics of history writing in the Ottoman Empire from the early modern period to the 19th century. Hi, Mustafa.
Hi, Alisa, and thank you for inviting me. This is a good opportunity to think again on my dissertation after 1 year.
Well, thank you for coming. So can you tell us a little bit more about your research? What did you try to show in your dissertation?
Let me start with very general definition of what I did in this thesis, in this dissertation. I actually worked on the universal history books written from the 17th century to the late 19th century. So the idea was to write a genealogy of the concept of TARIH-I UMUMI, which can be translated as general history or universal history, and definitely a 19th century concept. And I tried to find what kind of effects the earlier tradition of universal history has on these books and this concept, of course. The purpose of this was a kind of contribution to the general project of genealogies of the concepts in Ottoman Empire made by Alperen Topal and Einar Vigen and other people as well, of course. And of course, I tried to understand this concept of TARIH-I UMUMI by thinking with entanglement of European concepts. Firstly, of course, histoire générale, French concepts, and also the Ottoman traditional concepts of tawarih. This was an attempt to see this tradition of universal histories in Ottoman Empire through the lens of the 19th century Ottoman historians.
This sounds fascinating, but I still don't understand what you mean by universal history and how is it different from just history?
There are a lot of different possible definitions, of course, of universal history. And in actually one of them, there is no difference between history and universal history. And I am coming there in the late 19th century definitions of this concept. The historians actually use it interchangeably. Both TARIH-I UMUMI and TARIH refers to the same thing. But let's start with very first idea of universal history very briefly. Impossibility of bringing universal and history together, because from the beginning history was about particulars and actually not tells anything about the universality. But we can see a lot of universal history books from very early times, like the most famous one was Polybius's work, which was using the word tike, which is faith, or translated as faith. And for him, the tike brought all historical particulars together under the Roman Empire. At least history shows that for him. But of course, from here we can think about the concept of empire. Empire is one way of thinking historical particulars as universal. But also we have providential histories. That was also very important to think the universalities of historical particulars, in which the history started with the creation and ends with the judgment day. So the other things has been created by God as faith, and these are unfolding. So it's another way of thinking history in a universal way. This can be very, very general description, and I am actually trying to see the nuances between different universal history books. So if we think all of them as a providential history, then we cannot understand the differences between them. So I start with the 17th century, and I can see that these were very different from the earlier universal histories of Ottoman Empire. So I firstly started with thinking universal history with the words of the Ottoman historians. At first, I should say they didn't have any phrase for universal history until 19th century TARIH-I UMUMI concept. But I knew that there were a lot of universal history books, and there were definitions of these books in encyclopedic works like Katip Çelebi's Keşf-ı-Zunun. And I checked a lot of different universal histories definition in these books. I saw that there is one pattern that doesn't change. That is stressing the chronological scope of these works, which means that these tevari works, let's say, the histories works, starts with the creation or fall of Adam and comes to present diachronically. It doesn't have to be comprehensive in a geographical sense, but it must include all chronological continuity, the world's diachronic chronology, let's say. So this was my first idea to think universal histories. But I then realized that it is not always the case. In the 17th century, for example, I had a source written by Hezarfen Hüseyin Çelebi, who wrote Tenkihü't Tevari. This universal history starts not with Adam or other prophets, but Iranian mythical kings and kingdoms, those dynasties established by Kayumers. So for him, the chronology was not the basic thing indeed. The book brought all these particulars together with the principle of geographically universal world, and also made emphasis on the dynasty or state as a concept. So I could only find a new way of thinking the universal history, not by focusing on the universal history, the term universal history itself, but focusing on the practices of making histories universal. By this way, I try to analyze the discursive practices of the historians. And by this way, I also find a way to make emphasis on the subjecthood of the historians, their agencies, and how the history writing and politics could also be related directly. So at the end, I came to not define universal history, but try to understand what is the practice, what are the practices of making history universal.
Okay, let's just clarify some details because I'm not sure I understood correctly everything you were saying. So from the times immemorial, people used to think about history just as a series of some chaotic, random events which were not related, but then they started to look for some universal logic, and then discovered some kind of religious or political logic which was giving sense to all these unrelated events and putting them together. So you were talking about the Roman Empire, that was the imperial political logic. You were talking about Abrahamic religions, so it was the creation which was giving some sort of common logic to historical developments. And now in the 19th century, it was the encounter with the West and the new idea of the universe and science, which gave another kind of logic, common logic to history. But you are talking about the Ottoman concept of TARIH-I UMUMI, which has its own semantics, and I'm sure it is different from the English concept of universal history. So what is tarih and what is umumi in this particular context?
First, I will start with the term, not the concept of TARIH-I UMUMI. As I said, it is the 19th century invention. At first time, we can see this word, this phrase in the 1841 French Ottoman dictionary written by Alexander Hancheri, who used TARIH-I UMUMI as an equivalent to general history or histoire générale. And he gave another phrase for the universal history. But these were used in the 1850s, and especially we have evidence from the Encumeni Danish documents. Encumeni Danish was an academy of science established in the beginning of 1850s in Ottoman Empire. And these people were trying to write a universal history book. They launched a good and actually ambitious project of writing a universal history. The purpose was to prepare the textbook for the university which was to be established in, actually the plan was that. They couldn't actually succeed it, but we have a lot of writings, a lot of documents and some writings, some translations from French universal history book in this project. The documents are telling about the purposes of TARIH-I UMUMI and how can we write a TARIH-I UMUMI. Very enlightening for us to think, because in the 1870s this word and this kind of books will be very popular in Ottoman Empire, and they will make very different descriptions, definitions for universal history genre, let's say. So what I see as a difference, the basic difference at least, there are a lot of difference of course, but the basic difference was about what you ask about Tarih and what is Umumi, right? This is about the two basic connotations of the word general. One of them is about the comprehensivity, the other one is the meaning or applicability, let's say. Umumi here, which was used in the meaning of general or sometimes universal, we can think. In Encumeni Danish project, the purpose of the book was to bring all the particulars from different places of the world together and make very comprehensive, the most comprehensive universal history work of the time. This was very ambitious, but in the 1878 we see from Ahmet Mithat's universal history book, he announces that in the universal history, let's say, he says Umumiyet was not important, but the more important thing is Tarihiyet. This is a neologism made by Ahmet Mithat. There was no use of that kind of word, Tarihiyet, but it can mean some kind of historicism, maybe. But the basic purpose of finding this word here, Ahmet Mithat was trying to stress on the meaning of the history. History or universal history for him was the progress of the civilization of humanity. This progress could be seen in present. So what has happened in the history shaped our today was the basic idea of Ahmet Mithat. So he was trying to understand the civilization of his own age by looking to the history of the world. For that reason, not every events or every historical particulars were important for him, but there were specific important events in the history of the world. They constituted the universal history, not everything. So it doesn't have to be, or of course, not doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be that comprehensive indeed for him. But he actually wrote very comprehensive, at least started to write a very comprehensive world history in the beginning of 1870s, which is called Kainat. In the introduction of this book, he was telling that the universal history can be only defined by the umumiyet of history. So apparently he changed his mind. But what happened when he changed his mind? The question is this for me, and I understand that in the 1874 and 75, I found his article on actually his translation of Schiller's article. The article by Schiller was actually an inaugural speech at the University of Vienna at 1789. And the title of the lecture was "What is Universal History, and why should we read it? Why do we read it?" And Ahmet Mithat translated it as "Tarihi Umumi nedir? Biz onun için okuyoruz." So Ahmet Mithat, again, at first time probably there, he defined in the beginning of this article, he defined the Tarih-I Umumi as terakki-i medeniyeti beşeriye, which means progress of civilization of humanity. This emphasis on the progress he continued in the later works, and actually he made the other reflections about this. There was another book written in 1874 and 75 that was written by Ali Suavi, who was one of the member of, at least in the beginning, he was a member of the new Ottomans, and he will die in 2 years, in 3 years at least, in 78, when he rebelled against Abdülhamid II. In this book, he tried to write an addendum to Takvim-ü Tevari, the 17th century universal history. He was trying to apparently turn back to the chronology and make a redefinition of this universal history. But at the same time, he was trying to use the traditional knowledge of Ottomans. He was in Paris when he was writing this. And Ahmet Mithat, when he was writing the translation, actually making that translation of Schiller, he was in the exile in Rhodes Island. So he came back in the 76. Both of them came back to Istanbul in 76 with constitution. So it's very politically both tumultuous, but also a kind of turning point in Ottoman Empire. So why these very activist people were trying to understand some certain things through this concept of universal history or Tarih-I Umumi becomes something very important for me.
Well, I think this illustration of this double genealogy of universal history is just fascinating. We have two men who meet together and who do not agree on what and how universal history should be written. And there is one of them who is trying to translate European works into the Ottoman, and the other one who is looking at the beginnings of genuine Ottoman universal history. So he turns back to the 17th century. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was going on in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, and especially in Ottoman historical writing? For example, Subramanian differentiates between universal histories and New World histories, who began to be written in the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids, more or less during this period. So what do you think about this difference? Does it make sense to you? And does it make sense to the Ottoman context in general?
Yeah. Actually, Subramanian's distinction is not only about the gunpowder empires, but also more general, global phenomenon, I think. He differentiates the 16th century world histories, at least some of them at least, he says, were very different than the earlier universal histories. So one of the practical reason for him was apparent. There was a geographically very well defined, at least not perfectly, but still a well-defined globe now in the 16th century. So before then, of course, nobody has that kind of possibility to reach that kind of geographical universality. It makes sense. But also he makes one more point, and this is even more important than the first one. He says the boundaries become more blurred with the 16th century writings. This world, the 16th century, at least after the 16th century, can only be defined with more movements, more entanglements, more encounters. So the narratives cannot only be anymore, cannot be thought in itself a closed, complete things. And he is actually showing that in the narratives. When you tell about Ottoman Empire, you're not anymore just telling about Ottoman Empire, but you should go somewhere. You should go and tell other things in this specific narrative. So for him, actually, we can never see again these complete universal histories, which is very thought-provoking. And I definitely can see what he says in the Ottoman sources. Maybe I can be a little bit critical about the empirics. Like he uses Mustafa Ali's Kunhul Ahbar as an example of this. I would more think Kunhul Ahbar in between these two things, because his space, I think, his use of geography of the world is much more legendary and mythical than the later works. For me, the basic thing, what happened in the 17th century was the collapse of the sacred kingship. It was not, of course, something that you can find in prior to 15th century in Ottoman Empire, let's say, at least in some senses. But still, after this sacred kingship and this political theology of the 16th century, 15th, 16th centuries, after the collapse of this, the historians had to remake the universal themselves. What I observed in the 17th century was that just for that reason, they are questioning, could we attain the complete whole knowledge of world? For example, in Katip Çelebi's Takvim-i Tevarih, he begins with this question actually. He says, by quoting from Actually, he doesn't quote. He directly says like anonymous phrase, "Ma la yudraku kulluhu, la yutraku kulluhu," which means something cannot be known completely, should not be completely abandoned. So the same sentence I found in the beginning, in the cover of the English author, English, actually Arabic professor in Oxford University, Edward Pocock's translation of Abul Fida and Barhabros. In the book, in the cover of this book, there is a Latin translation of this same sentence. So it was also published in the 1650, almost in the same years with Katip Çelebi's Takvim-i Tevari. So I questioned this. Why did these people think like that? And I thought these people had a feeling of lost. They lost the universality. They had no. You cannot find this kind of things before this period, indeed, because they were thinking what they have written was complete, because it was the mirror of Levh-i Mahfuz in a sense. The God's faith that has been written in the beginning of the world. So of course there were a lot of incorrect things in all this, and they knew it. They always were very open in this, but at the same time, as a framework, they were very sure about themselves. They knew what they are talking about. The universe is this. But in Katip Çelebi, he was trying to make the universal himself by using the earlier knowledge. Again, there is another tradition for him. He applied basically to Abul Fida, Ibn Khaldun, and other historians of the medieval ages. So, and also later he used European sources as well. Same thing could be found in the Edward Pocock's example. He also used Arabic knowledge to make a new universal, make the totality more meaningful. I don't know, could they could make or not, but they try to do this. And later universal histories until the 19th century were definitely trying to do the same thing by using different methods of presenting, conceptual tools, graphic tools, diagrams, maps. They were trying to make historical particular universal again. Basically, all of them were unsuccessful because it is not possible. Until the late 18th century, European philosophical histories and the idea of progressive history and the application of this kind of universality in the Ottoman TARIH-I UMUMI in the late 19th century.
Well, I think this encounter between Pocock and Katip Çelebi is another beautiful illustration of the early modern world, where the flow of knowledge is unbound and it is not limited. Knowledge circulates and it is no longer Eastern or Western, if it ever was so. But what did occur in the 18th century? So in your dissertation, you describe this dynamic as not linear. More and more universal histories appeared in the 16th century, but there were almost no universal histories in the 18th century Ottoman Empire. So why was it so?
And apparently there is no single answer for this question. And among my questions, it is one of the most difficult one, because I'm thinking about this from the beginning of this project, indeed. because it's a kind of big gap and should be explained with something. I don't have still one single answer, but I am thinking more about the temporalities of 18th century. I'm focusing on one rare example of the universal history from the later period of the 18th century, written by Şemdanizade Süleyman Efendi. It's called Mürit Tevari. I could find the earlier autographs of the book and realized that the book is started as chronicle of the period he was living in. The intention of the author was not at first to write a universal history. But the more important feature of this book is it was an addendum, an exegesis of Takvim-ü Tevarih again. This addendum was on the Müteferrika version, which is printed in 1728 or 30 maybe. And Müteferrika used another version. There was another addendum before him, and he added 2 years, and then Şemdanizade added some 50 years or so. What I realized here in the 18th century, these people were thinking history they wrote as an addendum to the earlier histories. Every chronicler were actually following the previous one's writings. So they thought it as totally a universal history. But why didn't they write a single universal history? I can say, for example, the universal histories like Takvim-ü Tevarih, published by the first Ottoman print house by Müteferrika, would be a reason, because there were already a lot of Takvim-ü Tevarih around as well, and other works as well. And in this same period, in the 1720s, Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier of Ottoman Empire, he has launched a project of translating earlier classical books, let's say. Among them, there were at least 2 or 3 universal history books from earlier periods. And at the same time, this long 18th century, you can find a lot of new libraries constructed by these grand viziers and other patrons of the period. So already, apparently, these history books could be found much more easily than previous periods. And the public became much wider than earlier periods. For them, the history was something about political, about everyday life, about sometimes diplomacy, sometimes about the military activities of states, the peace agreement, and is it true or not. Actually, the content of these books were about this, and also very daily life of the public itself. One of the things I observed in the 18th century historiography, these historians, unlike Katip Çelebi, for example, put observation of the event as one of the most important things that must be done by historian. For them, historians must be there to see what happened and tell about it. It makes me think this historical writing as a parallel with the today's correspondent journalism. These historians were trying to follow public debates. And actually, in the 19th century, the first Ottoman newspaper was named as Takvim-i Vekayi. Maybe a coincidence or not, 2 different words. One of them refers to maybe, for me indeed, Takvim-ü Tevarih, and the other one is Vekayi Nüvis tradition. And so I'm thinking actually, why are we following the daily events every day by reading newspapers? This kind of temporality needs a kind of public life and public discussions. So it needs different politics, different state. State and politics must be defined by people. When I focus on why there is no universal history, I could not find any reason in it. But when I focus on why there is this kind of daily life, very technical, diplomatic, very detailed narratives of the world, then I could find this.
This is so interesting, especially how you show that the past is always about our present, right? And the past is a way of thinking about our present. And you mentioned this crisis of sacred kinship in the 16th century, the early modern period, then the increasing presentism and the emergence of the Ottoman public sphere in the 17th century. So another major change occurs in the 19th century with the Ottoman encounter with the West. Supposedly transfer of Western concept and Western idea of knowledge to the East. So do you consider the 19th century as a rupture or continuity of the Ottoman historical writing since the early modern period?
I found this rupture and continuity concepts very limiting and overly binary. I'm thinking the actors, most 19th century authors themselves, felt both rupture and continuity in varying degrees. Rather than a clean break or seamless development, the period was defined by a dynamic interplay of change and tradition, I think. And the shifting historiographical practices need to be evaluated in their specific intellectual and political context, I would say.
So what about this political context of historical writing in the 19th century? In your dissertation, you focus on different political figures. Some of them are trying to legitimize Ottoman authoritarianism, while others were preaching some sort of revolution. So can you say that their historiosophic models, their methods of history writing, and their ways to look at history or universal history differ too, along with their political opinions? Or were they following the same common logic of universal history or TARIH-I UMUMI?
I think despite political divisions, most 19th century historians shared a common belief in progress. This was what I call the changing telos of the history. So even conservative figures like Said Pasha envisioned a future marked by civilizational progress rather than, other kinds of cyclical narratives. Now we don't have that many apocalyptical visions of the history. History is in a sense of early modern period. But we have, in most of the actors, we have the same or similar historiosophic models. Still we can try to think, I tried indeed, to think some people's, for example, publishing the earlier books and using those books as textbooks in high schools and the universal history books, I mean. One example would be Nishancezade Tarihi from 16th century was used in the 1880s, late 80s, in Ottoman high schools. Just after Mizancı Murat's Tarih-I Umumi, which was very progress-based, and just after Mizancı Murat's being unwanted person, after their debate with Abdülhamid II. His book was banned in the high schools, and Nishancızade Tarihi started to be used again. It was a very interesting attempt, but there are some attempts like this, or even the publishing Mustafa Ali's or Taberi's, even Ibn al-Asir's books again, and there is of course this idea of showing the golden age of Islam here, but at the same time there were some people reading these books as much better universal histories than the new ones. But I could not see any significant attempt to write a universal history like this, like in different historiographic model. I could only try to think Ahmet Cevdet Paşa's Kısasül Enbiya ve Tevarih-I Hulefa, which is the story of the prophets and the history of the caliphs. Very interesting title, separating the story, kıssa, and history is very interesting, very new, modern way of thinking on this. But at the same time, I am thinking this book, if it was written and published 50 years ago, not in 1878, but not in 1820s, let's say, it would definitely be read as universal history, because as a scope, in traditional, let's say, universal histories, you could find those kind of scopes. But still, Ahmet Cevdet has never used universal history or something like that. Even he separated the tales or stories of prophets from the history part of the book. At least among the people who used TARIH-I UMUMI and who tried to write TARIH-I UMUMI, there is almost a consensus on this progressive idea of writing universal history after 1876, let's say.
This is an interesting point, and I think it also illustrates the weak side of thinking about temporality in Western terms, the Koselekian idea of temporality, because these are elite sources. So, as you mentioned, students at school were studying ancient histories, old Ottoman books, and their idea of history was more patchy. So we can find different temporalities here. So this hegemony of a linear temporality, of progress-related temporality, is also limited, as people in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century were using European time and traditional Islamic time at the same time. They were using these different ideas of histories, and I think it's really something important, and your contribution is crucial to our understanding of 19th century Ottoman population relation to time and history. Well, thank you so much, Mustafa.
Thank you, Alisa.
It was a great conversation. You will find links to the relevant literature in the description of the episode. And stay tuned